I want to say thank you to you and Sue and everyone at the Alaska Center for the book. On behalf of Peggy and myself, Frank's wife, Margot, and her family, Frank's brother, Tom, in North Carolina, whom I've known always as Moose, and so many of Frank's dear friends for conceiving of and hosting this tribute to Frank's words. It's an honor for me, and I know for Peggy as well, to be asked to moderate this series of readings by just a few of Frank's countless friends. I want to emphasize that this is a tribute, not a memorial service. We are making plans for memorial services for Frank in Fairbanks late this winter and in Maine next summer. Today, we're here to pay tribute to Frank's words. And as much as is possible, we want to afford Frank the opportunity to speak for himself through his words read by some of his dear friends. I'll call on each of the readers in turn to introduce their readings. And when we're done, Peggy will have the last words for the day, doing a reading of her own from a very soon to be published new book of Frank's short stories and some closing remarks. Before calling on each of those readers in turn, I want to do a very, very brief reading myself. Frank was my closest friend. We'd known each other since we were in undergraduate school at Davidson College in North Carolina together. And for more than 30 years, we'd had long discursive lunches. Every Wednesday, we were both in Fairbanks, talking about things great and small. The piece I want to read captures a little bit, I think, of the serendipitous nature of our discussions. A friend of mine from my hometown in South Carolina, a woman named Rebecca McCarthy, writes a column called Works in Progress for a journal called The American Scholar. She asked me a couple of years ago whether I had any suggestions of fun and interesting projects that people I knew were working on. And I told her that for almost 10 years, Frank had been sending me little written snippets of work toward a project that has not yet reached print, but that Margot and I and Peggy all hope will soon. It's called The World's 100 Best Ideas. And after talking with Frank about it, Rebecca wrote the following column about it, featuring Frank's words. This was in the October 27th, 2020 Journal of the American Scholar. It's called Consider the Zipper. About 8 years ago, a piece of junk mail promised Frank Soos, a retired English professor in Alaska, access to a book listing the 100 best ideas in the world, among them the rule of law and representative democracy. After skimming the list, however, Frank begged to differ, so he started compiling his own version. These included the bicycle, the pocket knife, rocking chairs, and silence, as well as the moon, space, and solitude. Like many writers, Frank says, I keep a small notebook with me at all times, and when an idea occurs to me, I write it down. This project, like many I pursue, began as a joke and then quickly jumped into other directions. What I write is tangential to the object, which is usually a think trigger. Take the entry for knots. Frank writes, if, as the Fishers say, and I know it to be true, any knot weakens the line, then what good might all those knots we've learned to fashion from childhood forward do? Sometimes, though, it's wrong to let a small truth stand in the way of a larger understanding. How else to live except by taking the long or short filaments of time, those joyful accidents, those terrors that cannot be avoided, those long stretches of waiting, simply waiting for whatever comes next, and skein them together to make a life. Subject to breakage and loss, this tying together is what we have. Or the very short entry that Frank wrote for Zipper. Frank writes, is there any sound sexier than a zipper pulled slowly in the dark? The column goes on to say, in addition to teaching, Soos has written books of essays, stories, and collaborations with his wife, artist Margot Class. For exhibits of her sculpture, he's written labels for each piece, and each label could only be 250 words. That experience informs his 100 Best Ideas project as well. No entry is longer than that. I write about concrete things, Soos says, like combs, and abstract things such as solitude and transcendence. It's not science. I need them to be ideas, and they are. Rebecca's column concludes with a brief list of some of Frank's other best ideas: antimatter, Converse All-Stars, crayons, flying saucers, geometry, grace, hot dogs, kites, milk, kittens, rocking chairs, sandboxes, skinny dipping, sporks, tents, and toothbrushes. That's a little bit of the way Frank thinks. With that, I will turn it to our next speaker, and that is Robert Hannon.
Thanks so much, Cass. Just briefly, when a radio producer is asked to read something of somebody, he has actual tape, he'll go to the tape, or he or she'll go to the tape. And that's what I did in this case. I'm going to play a little piece I organized for Frank. And I hope, let's see, I'm going to make sure that I can share this.
I had the privilege since roughly the early 1990s to record with Frank dozens of reviews for broadcast. Obviously, most of these were literary in nature, but when UAF hosted the top of the world basketball tournament, Frank would routinely analyze the games. As you can imagine, I had a lot of material to draw from in my tribute, but I wanted to focus on three elements: the writing life, the world of ideas, and Frank's collaborations as a teacher and artist. Frank's impulse to offer these reviews arose from the same imaginative landscape that informed his writing. Many of the authors he chose to present took up questions and ideas that Frank wrestled with. Here, for example, is his review of a collection of essays by Janet Malcolm.
This piece I'm reading from is a little piece called The Master Writer of the City, which is from the New York Review of Books, but it's an appreciation of the old New Yorker writer Joseph Mitchell. And it's a complicated piece. That appreciation is a surprise coming from Malcolm. It turns out that Joseph Mitchell did have a habit of inventing, sometimes out of whole cloth, sometimes building composite characters for his pieces that appeared in the New Yorker. We think of the New Yorker as this paragon of factual accuracy, but Mitchell violated that all the time. He just made stuff up when he needed to. And Malcolm surprisingly gives him a pass. I'm a little surprised, though, that she is so generous with Joseph Mitchell about this, because she's the woman who took down Joe McGinnis for his book Fatal Vision, about the murdering Dr. Jeffrey MacDonald. And that book became The Journalist and the Murderer, wherein Malcolm shows how Joe McGinnis really pretty much infected that story, not affected, but infected it by his presence, and in a way that she felt would go completely overboard and way beyond acceptable norms. You could say that especially about Capote and In Cold Blood, which is a book where he faked a lot of stuff, as it turns out, and once again, it went sliding past the New Yorker. Fact checkers with a pass. So that's a problem. And she's very candid about that being a problem.
All of you know Frank had little or no patience with alternative facts in writing. But because Frank wasn't a naive realist, he also recognized getting things accurately was problematic, as he made clear in this review of Oliver Sacks' collection of essays.
He argues that we disremember regularly. Every time we remember an event, we, in effect, reconfigure it. Some of that just has to do with turning it into words. But he would say, so in that way, even the most positive memories are finally unreliable, that we can't trust our memories. That's a hard problem, especially if you're a writer. You think, well, I thought I remembered this rightly.
That said, Frank's writing draws deeply on the world of ideas as well as his collaborations with other thoughtful and creative folks. When I interviewed him, I asked him about his collaborations with Peggy Shoemaker in the English department.
The job mattered, and it mattered a lot that we were colleagues that we could count on with one another. If we said we were going to do something, that would be done, and it would be done as well as we could do it. And that matters.
Curiously, for the self-professed lone wolf, collaborations came suspiciously often, perhaps most importantly with Margot and Kess.
Then Margot makes these pieces, and then I come and I look at them and I respond to them, and she has a certain amount of editorial control. She can veto things or ask for changes, and so there's some back and forth there. But in that book, the visual art came first, and my responses came second. When you couple them with Margot's art, then that's the conversation. And that's something that Cass and I also ended up talking a lot about when we were editing Under Northern Lights. We did not want the art to be illustrations, and we did not want the text to be explanatory about the art. Each one of them was going to talk to the other one in a way that created some tension between the two, so that the reader would have to think, well, okay, now what's that piece of art got to do with this?
Finally, I can't think of a better example of Frank's deeply reflective and generous nature than to hear him read from his most recent book of essays, Unpleasantries.
Where do most of us go nowadays when we go looking for the dead? The first mummy I ever saw was in Basel, Switzerland. I was bumming around Europe. It was a Sunday, and I couldn't think of anything to do except visit the small nearby museum. There it was, all unwrapped and about the size I was in the 4th grade. Recognizable as a crudely formed human being, but that's about it. Not at all like my Uncle Joe in his casket. Not at all like my mom when her heart stopped, her blood stopped circulating, and the color drained from her face. A dead person with no place left to be except in this hermetically sealed glass case. Just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, is an experimental station run by the Virginia Department of Transportation. There, cadavers are placed in cars, crashed into other cars with a cadaver at the wheel, and inspected for damage. I think of my dad when I pass by. My dad had hoped to give his body to be used by a medical student at the University of Virginia, where he had been treated and cured of cancer the first time around. These days, though, once a person donates his corpse to the state, he has no say in how it might be used or how it might be disposed of. Once it has served its purpose, the remains are cremated. We have no idea where my dad's ashes went.
I just want to conclude and say what an honor it was to work with Frank all those years and count him as a friend and teacher. And I know that's true for all of you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was wonderful to hear Frank's words in his own voice. And we'll next turn to Nancy Lord and Homer.
Thank you, Cass, and thanks, Robert, for that great piece of tape. Just gonna change my view here. So when Frank died, I, of course, turned to his writings for some comfort, and especially Unpleasantries, which I had bought when it first came out, but not really spent much time with. I kind of dipped in and out of it, but hadn't read it in its entirety. So I sat down to read it all the way through, and it was such a comfort to just spend some time with Frank's words and to be taken into his world of thought. I really enjoyed learning more about his boyhood, his relationship to his hometown in Pocahontas and with his family and friends, and and his relationship to sports as well, and so on. One of the pieces in here that I'm not going to read from, but that I especially enjoyed, was the essay about building a boat, and it being an imperfect boat that he compares to also the act of writing as another craft, and how you know, as a writer, you never rise to your ambition, and anyway, I especially love that piece. But I want to read though from the one that's called Kinds of Ambition, because throughout this book there's so much. In Frank, he personifies for me the essayist, or the essayist of weighing things and considering really the purpose of living, questions of just how we live, and what our ambitions are, and failure. So this piece that I'm going to read from, and if anyone wants to read along, it's on page 186, but it's the essay called Kinds of Ambition. It's in 3 parts, and I'm just going to read the first part of it here. 1, do lessness. As boys, my brother and I could always be found on the cusp of do lessness. Weren't there groceries to be delivered, shelves to stock, floors to sweep? There was no time to sit on top of the pop cooler and moon out the window at passing cars, passing girls, and my mom, my Aunt Rosie, my dad were constantly in motion, doing all those things and more, talking, taking and filling orders that came in over the phone, cutting up chickens, cutting pork chops, keeping the books, paying the bills. Do less, one of my mom, the chief's favorite words, a word with multiple applications in our hometown. From Homer Jennings, a man who'd maintained he had a bad back as long as I ever knew him, a man who could be found loafing on the bench in front of the company store, on a bar stool, at the Cricket or the Anchor, or standing on the bridge with all the other loafers, to the kids I went to school with who didn't do their lessons, didn't help out with others at home, didn't help out with chores at home, and dropped out only to wind up soon enough, just like Homer Jennings. It's true that after Sunday dinner, a sumptuous meal my parents had prepared and set in motion before going to church, they both dozed over the Sunday paper or in front of the TV, no matter how exciting the ball game might be, while my brother and I often raced around outside with our pals. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion, objects at rest. Well, there you have it. What makes a person want to do? Here's a baby at a stage when he's trying to roll over by himself. He can get halfway there, but not the rest. Still, he tries and tries again to complete the maneuver. Here is an older child who has rolled over, crawled, and by pulling himself up with the support of the couch or the coffee table, begun to walk. Now she walks. One day she will run and jump. There's something animal in such ambition, to crawl, walk, run, and jump. But where does the ambition come from? To add, subtract, multiply, and divide, to do the calculus, to tell our stories using stuffed animals as actors, to find new words for the telling, to what end and at what far-flung end. Maybe our ambition is like the snow caves mountaineers build as they ascend, holes bored out of the snow to make a livable space. Between ice and rock, there's a limit to how big some snow caves can be, and up to that point, maybe there's only the limit of how much ambition we have as we dig one. In our household, there were many if-then sentences. If you don't do your homework, you can't go outside and play. If you don't get your grades up, you'll have to quit the ball team. If you don't stock those shelves, you can't use the car tonight. But there was one important when clause in many sentences. When you go to college. Going to college for my brother and me was as certain as gravity. We would go. After my mom's death, my wife found a checklist she had made for me among her papers. It was a list of tasks written in her palm method penmanship, a list I needed to complete to get ready to go to college. At the bottom, doubly underscored were the words, do something. Getting us into college, dropping us off at the dormitory, helping us carry our things to our rooms. That was as far as my mother's imagination could see us, as far as her ambition could carry us. Now it was up to us. Her ambition would somehow have to become our ambition, our first charge, not to fail. Check. Then what? So I thank Frank for all of his words that we have, and for the legacy of his tremendous teaching. So many of us have learned so much from him, and for his friendship. And it's really lovely to be with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And with that,
participants.
we'll turn again to Homer, this time to Tom Kazaya.
Thanks. Thanks, Kes. So there's this new TV show called McCartney 321 that I've been watching, in which Paul McCartney and a famous sound engineer go over the old Beatles songs, and the engineer cranks up the bass line to 10, or they, throws up the chords, and McCartney explains, this is what George was trying to do here. And the song sounds completely different, but it's the same song, and everything in there was very deliberate. And I thought about this when I went back to reading some of Frank's works after he died, and it was like the mortality was cranked up to 10. It read differently, but it was all deliberate, and it was all there to begin with. And I wanted to read about fly fishing, which is something that he and I had shared and talked about. And so I'm reading from his bamboo fly rod suite. And I hope he'll forgive me for skipping around just a little bit. But mostly this is from On His Slowness. Sometimes I look like an idiot. I hang up my back cast high in a tree. I overshoot my cast into the brush on the far bank and stand there looking at my dangling fly in a branch across a stretch of current too deep or too swift to wade. What's there to do but to try to whip my rod around with the vague hope my line will work loose until I give up and break off? No accounting of my life as a fisherman would be completely honest without admitting to all the above moments, good and bad. While they may demonstrate why I prefer to fish alone, I've come to accept them as the balled up elements of who I am. Gradually, I've come to see acceptance itself as an aspect of my slowness, an attitude that says, take it easy. This is how the world goes. This is how you are one part of it. A deep current runs through my bones, the essential truth of slowness, which is to say, when the bamboo fly rod came into my hands, it seemed like it was made just for me. I said to Howie at the fly shop as he advised me on how to fix it up, it's going to be slow, isn't it? It's going to be slow, he told me with maybe a shade of regret in his voice. It wasn't like I was getting the hard news after my kid's first IQ test. Having long since accepted my own slowness, I saw my perfect match. And it was slow. I didn't know, I couldn't know. For years, it was my only rod. It took a long time for me to find the feel of casting, having only the illustrations in a Boy Scout merit badge book to help me. It took me just as long to learn the feel of the clutch in our Chevrolet. In both cases, it was because I was clumsy as well as slow, or maybe slow because I was simply clumsy. Often they go together, but I did learn the fly rod. Once I felt its rhythm and learned to wait for the back cast, learned to wait for the fly resting on the lake, learned to wait until just about dark when the serious fish got interested, I knew I'd never tire of it. When I'm fishing, time becomes elastic. My wife and I have an understanding. I fish while she sits on the bank in her fold-out chair, reads a book, and waits. How long to wait is always a matter for negotiation. There's never enough time to be on a river once we've arrived. My own sense of time is governed by each cast and its drift, by each hole, no matter how unlikely where a fish might be holding. Every flat spot in a run of broken water is worth a cast or two. The long pools, perfectly formed for fish holding in the tailwaters, fish resting in the fat middle, fish feeding at the head, require a strategy. I stretch out on a warm, flat rock to reconnoiter the situation, reconsider my fly pattern, give the fish a chance to forget about whatever noise I made in getting here. Hours pass. The river goes on forever, or at least I haven't fished to the end of one yet. If I'm aware of time at all, it is through noises in my stomach and then through the diminishing light in the sky. I will be in a little trouble by now. Yet it would be the same if I were the one with the folding chair and the book. I would disappear into the pages of that book and stay inside for as long as it took, coming out the other end, fresh from another world, fresh from a kind of dream, renewed and awakened. On a good day, fishing is just like that. What in the world can be better done in a hurry? Surely some things can be done more quickly. I envy people who can turn out a nicely tied dry fly in 10 or 15 minutes, those who tie sure, fast knots. I envy those who react to a rising fish always just in time. But when I try quickness, I get a tangled up rush. The fly I tie is a mess not worth fishing. The knot must be redone. And I miss the fish too often by anticipating its strike. When I'm in a rush, I make less of the little time I do have. Ill-considered choices are compounded by careless actions. Hurrying becomes a useless, self-defeating strategy. Hurrying is denying the truth of my slowness. I wish I could say the bamboo fly rod has solved all my problems. It remains true to Howie's prediction, slow. It is, as the guy in Texas said in his high-handed way, heavy. Yet most days it feels right, which means it feels slow, and slow is what I come by naturally. I like the slow arcing flex of the rod, bending well into the middle section. It must take more time for such a rod to bend and unbend itself, to let go of its power and put it into the line. I like to think I feel it in my long, bony arms. No fishing rod can solve my problem. My problem is the world itself that has so little understanding of and places so little value on slowness. Sometimes I feel like I'm forever wading upriver against a fairly stiff current, picking up one foot, testing my balance, stepping, bringing the other foot up beside it, waiting before the next step while time keeps pushing against me. While waiting, I'm looking to see the indignant squirrel up the spruce tree for the prospect of some blueberries on the bank, moose tracks in the soft silt, maybe a fish under the cut bank. No matter how slow I go, the sun ticks across the sky, indifferent to my pace. It's helpful to remember that. And the last words of the book. I take to the river in the last good days of fall. The leaves are yellow and dropping, but the river is still full of life. Bugs are rising and the fish are following them to the surface. In the quiet, I cast and hear my line rattle through the guides as my own bug settles on the water. Soon it will be cold. The fish will regard my flies from the river's bottom with lazy suspicion. Here are days. There won't be any others. So I will be thinking of Frank this fall when the steelhead are ignoring my bugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful. We'll hear one more voice from Homer before we move on, and that is Wendy Erd.
Thank you, Cass. And thank you for putting this all together. It's really pretty special. And Tom, that was a wonderful lead into what I'm going to read, which is a poem that Frank wrote for a project called Poems in Place that I coordinated, and along with the help of many people. And so in 2013, we picked 2 state parks and invited anyone to submit poetry for one of those 2 parks. And Frank, there was an article about the Poems in Place dedication that was going to happen. And Frank said in the article, when I heard it was one of the places picked, I said, I probably have something to say about that. And the result was this poem he wrote called The Blue Fish, which is what some old time Alaskans sometimes use that term for a grayling. And also in that article, Frank said, the first fish I caught in Alaska back in 1986 or 1987 was an old grayling. When they get older like that, they do start getting blue along the top. I had no idea that particular fish was that unique. I've never caught one like it since. So in September of 2013, and I hadn't met Frank, and I hadn't met all the wonderful, warm, small circle of friends, Peggy and Margot and Dorla and Joe. And anyway, I was just so welcomed in, stayed at Margot and Frank's place for before the dedication. And, you know, it was just like that piece that Tom wrote about, because it was just sparkling gold. All the trees I remember were beautifully gold, and the sky was blue. And we all went to the place along the river. He joked, I asked him when his poem was picked to be one of the 2 poems in place. And I asked him, well, Frank, where do you think that poem ought to go? And he just thought for a minute, and then he said, you know, I think I know exactly where it should go. And he said it should go on a bend by the Rosehip campground. So he knew right where that poem should be placed outside. And so we all went there on that day, and Peggy introduced Frank. And later on, we went up. Tess has a beautiful piece of artwork. He was also involved in this because he has a piece of artwork that went with a John Haynes poem called Poem of the Forgotten. Anyway, on that day, this beautiful day for a dedication, river was really sparkly. And as I recall, Frank said when he was talking about how that poem came into being, that he wrote it on the back of an envelope. And he just thought about it, and then he just wrote it down on the back of an envelope. So anyway, I hope that all of you, when you get a chance to go up to Chena River, can go out to the Rosebud Campground and read this poem, which is graced by Frank's words. So the poem is called The Blue Fish. In a land where every spring makes this river new, few things grow old. The blue fish, its body, once a narrow gray torpedo, transformed, indigo, calico, the many ways blue is blue, changed by time alone. Its turquoise splashed dorsal flag, its pectoral fins shot through with rays of black and orange. We'd like to think it got that way through its fishy wisdom, but really it got that way just by living. The first fish I ever caught here was a bluefish. I held it in my hand, wonderstruck, then let it go. I didn't know. I come here often, I come back, hoping to catch another. So that's where it is on the bend in the river. So Frank's words are there, speaking to the fish and the river and the sky and those beautiful trees, and to whoever happens to stop by and read. And I just feel so grateful that I had a chance to get to know Frank through that project. He was just one of the most humble and gentle and easygoing, fun people, and wonderful poet. So thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share that poem. I hope you can all go there one day and read it for yourselves.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was a perfect day. And thank you for sharing it and bringing it back to those of us who were there and sharing it with those who weren't able to be there. With that, we'll turn to David Stevenson.
Thanks, Cass and Peggy, and to Lila and Sue for arranging this event and inviting me to be part of it. I probably haven't known Frank as long as many of you in the room here. We were introduced by our great mutual friend, Sherry Simpson. Actually, Sherry set it up practically like a blind date. And I remember reporting back to her like a junior high kid or something and say, boy, you were right. I really love Frank. It was like, we've known each other all our lives. And she just said, yeah, I knew it would be that way. So I'm reading a really short piece from Frank and Margot's collaboration, which is probably, you can't read unless you're looking in a mirror. It's called Lives of the Saints, Contemporary Icons and Reliquaries. It's one of the true collaborations. It's Margot's photographs of Margot's little sculptures in conversation with Frank's words. And this is Saint Cheryl Ann, patron saint of those who might better get along without us. Protectress. While some more famous saints encouraged wild animals to eat from their hands, Saint Cheryl Ann took the opposite view. Why didn't we just let them be? Burdened with consciousness, we people couldn't walk through the woods like wolves and moose and bears. Was it the fact of our being there or the act of our knowing that took the fun out of everything? Probably things went wrong beginning with our naming those others. They have no name for us, but recognize us just the same. In their eyes, it's plain to see how they would name us if they could. Traitor, enemy, not of our kind. The other piece I want to read is also from Unpleasantries. I'll just read a short selection. I was reading from my own work down at the Ketchimak Bay Conference down in Homer in Alice's Champagne Palace, if you know the place. And I was reading a piece that had a passage about my son's death, and I got choked up. It happens to me whenever I try to read those pieces. And afterwards, Frank said, you know, David, my cousin died over 30 years ago. And whenever I try to read about him, the words just catch in my throat. And that piece is in Unpleasantries. It's called Meditation on My Cousin Lou, Dead at 33. I'm just going to read a little bit from the end, the last section. And as someone pointed out earlier, a lot of Frank's words resonate differently now that he's gone, more powerfully, if that's possible. These are some of those. Jeannie's new house. Jeannie was Lou's widow. The piece is called Meditation on My Cousin Lou, Dead at 33. Jeannie's new house still looks kind of naked. It's bigger than the old place, and the furniture won't quite fill it up. Jason's kindergarten teacher and her husband, who teaches music, are there. Jason likes school, and his teacher says the atmosphere brightens when he comes into the room. To watch him play, zipping around the room and up the stairs, sliding down them all the while holding a toy man on a motorcycle before him, is to watch his father. I have played on the floor with his dad as the adults talked, as we are talking about Jason's return to school after the holidays, about how he is handling it. I know that despite all his frenetic activity, he's listening, as we used to listen while the grown-ups talked, hoping he will hear something that in a sentence might make it all right again. I'm listening too and looking. The street outside is quiet. People read the paper. They don't save the clipping for the family as they would for a wedding or birth. But having seen the obituary, they stop a little. And when they pass the house, they drop their voices and their eyes. Men who have no words come up to my father and press money into his hand for the kids, for their college. The cable company will match every dollar. I think this combination of grief and generosity is Pocahontas's way of coming to terms with Lou's death. He was a good man, a good husband and a father. He helped his neighbors in small ways. Small town people may understand these acts are the truest indicators of a person's character, and through them, they will remember Lou. And I will still be wondering why he died. His sudden death momentarily stripped my mind and left the feelings bare. I remember walking out the gate, the cold weight of the latch in my hand, the cracks of the sidewalk through my shoe. The new house is on Moore Street, and the previous owners cut down the big maple in front. They couldn't get the stump out. Cut to level ground, it remains. We're glad to have all of Frank's words. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Wonderful, powerful stuff. With that, we'll turn to Nancy Cook.
Hi, everybody, and thank you. I hope I don't choke up too much. I feel a little sheepish because I was one of Frank's students 2000 to 2003 at UAF, and there's so many students I know who would like to honor him. And I'm very honored to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I have to say, as I do that, the one thing I can say about the pain of losing Frank is that there was never a minute I spent with him that I didn't genuinely cherish. He brought out the best of me and so many of his students, and he was so easy to love that I do know I enjoyed every minute. So as we know, Frank supported the arts all around the state, and he had a beautiful, adventuresome spirit. And as Lila shared, I brought him to the Wrangles to Kennecott 5 different times between 2001 and 2015. And he loved Kennecott. I think it reminded him of his old mining town. So there's a few photos here of Frank in Kennecott and Frank inside our old hardware store teaching, Frank on hikes, always watching out. A few years later, Kess and John Morgan and Sherry Simpson and Frank and David Grimes and I had the absolute pleasure to float the Copper River with some friends. Here we are at Miles Lake. Here's Frank smiling big and the big yellow raft called the Sun with Kess and Morgan. And Grimes, he loved Captain Grimes. The last time I spoke with Frank, we spoke of Captain Grimes, the shrine we built, the EX salmon goddess Whitney, then brought us 5 salmon, which we ate amongst 15 of us in one night. We gathered firewood and made art. Frank also loved Mark Vail. We made art and made music, and Kess made a painting when he got home. He says he put the rafts in there, which is rare for Kess. He said he did it for scale, but watching you with Frank that whole week, I imagine if you're going to put somebody in a painting, it would be your best buddy. As one of the students, so many of you here today were part of our classes. Musgrave was frequently mentioned, as was Peggy, as were his favorite students or the students who brought him pride, Sherry and Eva. And in my era, Dan O'Neill, there was also a book of poems came from that trip. And these photos, here's Frank, happy to be with Sherry and happy. A few years later, and I have to say, I lived through the era where I knew Frank before and after Margot, and it was so wonderful to witness the joy and contentment, stability she brought to his life. So it was a joy to bring Frank back with Margot to do what we called creative cross-pollinations, where we made a community quilt and made a collaborative book. Here's our group Jeremy Pataki was a huge part of that week. Here's Frank's offerings to our book. Rocks come bringing change. You found the right place still. Constancy abounds. And here's Frank's truck, which he put in the quilt. I love Frank's truck. Here's another group not that long ago on a workshop we call River Song. And this is Frank. He's always seeing pictures. This is from McCarthy to Chitna at a place called Skull Creek, where I first heard his essay about skiing and being like a moose, another kind of loneliness. He read it there. I absolutely love this picture of Frank the Argonaut and his big smile and his spirit of adventure. I saw Frank on his last day in Fairbanks, and we caught up with all of our friends. And I know so many of you would have liked to be there at his last coffee, and I just want you to know how lucky I feel. And now we have his words. I've spent the better part of the weekend going through my journals, mining through my journals for every craft talk of his I ever heard. And maybe someday I'll type them all up for you. But what I want to read today is from Upside Down and Backwards. Not Upside Down and Backwards. That was one of his favorite essays that I listened to Craft Talks for. That was a Bowman essay, Upside Down and Backwards. Frank's essay is Upside Down with Borges and Bob. And it's about when he crashed his truck, which I heard about so many times. His truck's there 35 feet down the bank, its dusty entrails exposed to the sky, driver's side door cocked open. And then this, did your life flash before your eyes? Did you see any interesting sights, my friend? Farnham asked me a few days later. I saw my truck sliding up the road wildly to the right, and then after some furious steering, sliding wildly to the left. I saw it headed back to the right again, and this time as the road curved to meet it, there was not enough space to execute any more desperate maneuvers. I say I saw because it seems to me now that I can actually see this wreck as if I were hovering above it in a helicopter, no longer a participant, but a witness. In his Labyrinth, Jorge Luis Borges suggests we can live thousands of parallel lives of the imagination, an ideal that appeals to me just now. In one of these lives, I am efficient, organized. In another, I ski like an Olympic medalist. In another, I am a fabulously more successful writer than he was. When I try these Borges premises on a class full of undergraduates, they have no trouble seeing it for the hooey it is. Who would trade in the life we are living for, any imagined life, even if that imagined life contains no vehicles in the ditch, insurance adjusters, smart aleck truck drivers, leisure-prone auto body men? Nonetheless, I'm still attracted to the idea of following the truck and watching myself, or watching the truck with me in it. And I feel compelled to run this film loop again and again. I'm skipping big time. About this one thing, Borges is undeniably right. We are born, and then after a while, if we're lucky, we die. It's how we manage what's in the middle that matters. But unlike the characters we meet in his story, The Garden of the Forking Paths, I cannot accept with equanimity a future that excludes me. I cannot imagine a world without me in it. Even the rippling wave of possibility that runs out on without me still contains my conscience presence. I always suspected something was going to kill me too, maybe cancer, maybe heart failure, maybe an accident of one kind or another, but I had not believed it and still do not believe it. If I did, would I have spent the past few Sunday hours differently? skipping, would I have spent the past then 44 years any differently? Would I still be waiting for my sabbatical to put my life in order? No and yes. Based on the evidence that is myself, what other honest conclusion could I draw? My neighbor, Bob Bell, puts his hand up to the top of my head. I just wanted to see if you were any shorter after your wreck. I wish for miracles myself, and I wonder what constitute a miracle these days. I'm respectful of our time, but I want to get through another little part. I made a mistake, I tell my neighbor, Bob. No, he says, you had an accident. It's all a question of control, my own or somebody else's. Going too fast, weren't you? The wrecker owner says, fixing me with his bloodshot eyes. In Bob's view, a miracle might be the presence of God and the absence of control. God will take care of things in whatever way suits of him. All of us agree with Bob on some level. If I go back in time, I see no need to alter my grandfather's failing health. To do so is only to postpone an understood inevitability. I can't stop his death from happening, only delay it. In this way, I accept for others what I cannot accept for myself. I fight against it like a fish against the surprising hook and line. What if, as Borges suggests in The Secret Miracle, time might come in bubbles, like notes of music, given different values and filling up different durations. I slow my life to adagio. Let's say I could stand on the roadside and make a hole in time, a tear in the cloth, and crawl through it, into it. Wouldn't I do everything differently this time? He talks about things he would do differently, but then he concludes that he wouldn't. Because to wish it this way is to accept missing the small black bear that ambled across the road in front of our truck, the very truck now down the bank on top of Murphy Dome, or the moose that was in the road on the way back from an abbreviated fishing trip when my wife fell in the river and we had forgotten our extra clothes. So that trip was futile, a waste of time, 2 hours of driving for a few minutes of fishing. But we saw a moose and a bear in this world, in these times. Moose and bear are wonders to see on the verge of slipping from us so quickly we will scarcely have time to realize our regret for having let them go. So he concludes he wouldn't do much differently, but this last moment is what I would like to revise the most right now, to just run the film loop and reverse the way we did the old 8mm reel shown on a bed sheet in my parents' living room, the last thrill of the evening, to watch herself undo all our actions, to back right off the screen into nowhere. My truck flips back onto its left side, then up onto its wheel, and rolls back up the bank out into the roadway, swerves wildly backward down the road until it reaches the bottom of the hill. There, let's leave it at that. Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you, Nancy, for those poignant words and those happy images and happy memories of times.
Read that whole essay.
With that, we'll turn to John Gimble. Thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Do I need to do anything else? There we go. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to follow Tessa's instructions at the start, and I've jettisoned most of the setup to this. But let me just say that in a lot of salient areas, Frank's interests and mine didn't really overlap, but nonetheless, it was a very genuine friendship. I'm not sure exactly what he saw in me, but I'm certain that he never in his life ever faked a friendship. And if I could just mention three of many things that really attracted me to him, one was his ability to talk about just about any topic on earth very intelligently, unlike most of us Alaskans that just kind of, make it up as we go along. And second was his kindness and generosity. There are a couple sites out there on the web where former students have written an awful lot about that and just how giving he was. I was outside examiner on many of his MFA projects, saw that up close and personal. And often at midnight sun readings, he would come over and invite me to go out for drinks afterwards with the writer and some of the others. And my gosh, it felt like being back in high school where, the math nerd got invited to sit with the really cool kids at the back of the cafeteria. And lastly, it's that issue of light, that spark that he just seemed to bring to everything, how he was constantly probing the universe, finding joy, beauty, passion, and adventure in the way he engineered his life to meet the specifications of all of those matters. And so with that, I would like to read from a longer piece titled More Light. He published this in 49 Writers, Solstice 2015. In that piece, he talks about going to a very nice solstice party and going cross-country skiing the next day with many of his friends. And I've jettisoned that part, but here's what remains then. Surely there are no people living near the poles who don't anticipate and celebrate the returning of the light. We are animals who crave the light. I'm thinking about Dylan Thomas's plea to his father to resist going gently into that good night, of that inevitable connection between darkness and death, which is not to say that I'm feeling poorly these days. I feel pretty healthy just now. It's our larger culture that seems to want to usher me down the exit ramp. Item from the Ellsworth, Maine American. This is a weekly newspaper there in mid-coast of Maine. Goldsboro Police helped Winter Harbor Police, September 20, in an accident involving an elderly man. Police said the man lost control of his bicycle and went off the road. He was transported to the Maine Coast Memorial Hospital, which just coincidentally is also sometimes called the Northern Light Hospital. That elderly man, I'm he. And obviously he's not talking about his most recent bicycle accident. It turns out Frank had several fairly serious accidents with his bicycle. I'm he. Yes, I was a bit befuddled from the knock on the head I suffered, but anybody would have been. What's annoying is the implicit notion that somehow I should not have been where I was doing what I was doing. I'd say I was simply living my life. I don't know how else to live, and I'm not sure I or anybody else needs to live any other way than his own. We're here to do what we can, what we love, for as long as we're able. Here were the small episodes of joy, honestly come by. Tomorrow, the day you read this, fellow writer, the Fairbanks day will be 4 seconds longer. In all our rushing around, we may fail to notice that little bit of new light, but it'll be there. Still, I find it difficult not to think on those I know and love who've been hit hard by events in their lives that make it hard to live as they might wish, or even to continue to live. Yet even at the worst of times, we live as we're able, live as only we can. More light. Those were said to be Goethe's last words. They needn't be a valediction, though. Instead, let's think of them as a wish for everything that can happen in the coming light. And I think probably all of us who have left behind wish that maybe Frank could have gone a little more gently at times, maybe not ridden the bicycle quite so fast, hit the curves quite so hard, been around to give a little bit more light. But hey, we heard it from him right here. That's our problem, not his. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. With that, we'll turn to David Abrams.
That was great.
Thank you, Kes, and thank you to Lila and everybody else for inviting me to participate in this remembrance of our dear friend Frank. I was a student of Frank's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at UAF from 1992 to 2004. Off and on, that seems like a long stretch of time, but it was off and on because I was balancing. I finally earned my MFA while I was balancing a full-time career in the Army and the happy demands of a family of 5. But I was Frank's student in the deepest sense of the word. I like so many of you, like everybody Frank knew and touched. I learned so much from Frank, how to be a reader, how to be a writer. But mostly I saw in him an example of how to be a good human being. Frank and I kept touch when I left Alaska and went off for the good fight in Iraq. He brought me back to Alaska briefly during the tour for the publication of my first novel. And that was the last time I saw Frank. But good memories. And also bittersweet ones when I think of his passing. When I learned of his death, I scoured my journal and did a kind of word search for his name and found many instances where I mentioned Frank and words of wisdom he had given us in his classes, and the stories he would tell in classes. I'll just read you one really quick one from my journal that I recorded in March of 1993. And then I'm going to read something from Unpleasantries. But this is 1993, March. Frank said, he may have told the story before too, but he said to us, "My mother was our Sunday school teacher, and every year she told us the story of the loaves and fishes, wherein she demonstrated it with a 3 Musketeers bar. She'd cut it up into these little slices, but it only proved to us that one bite of a candy bar could make you hungry for 2 hours, all the way through the sermon until lunch." So that was Frank. And I wish I could read in Frank's beautiful voice. I mean, his voice is what I remember so much about Frank. But I'm going to have a go at the preface. I'm going to read parts of the preface from Unpleasantries, which, by the way, I had on my bookshelf unread from the date of its publication. I had it unread and I was always saving it for that right time. That right time was 2 days after Frank's passing. So that's when I started reading Unpleasantries. And it was a pleasant reading experience because of Frank's beautiful writing. But he speaks in here, as everybody else has mentioned already, he speaks in here to us mortality so much. And the words just really leapt off the page. But I chose the preface because this was the first I got introduced to Unpleasantries and it really struck me. So here's Frank. "I'm a messy guy. My desk is a mess covered by sliding piles of paper. My workbench is a mess, so the tool I need is rarely at hand. My personal library a mess with books shelved in no reliable order and stacked all over the floor. The essay can be a messy form. Maybe that's why I write them. Still, a person should try to be neat. Fiction can be neat. Writing a good story is typically about diminishing choices. Each juncture of a plot is a reduction of characters' options. I like to write short stories. I like that process of funneling down until I can find that final action, the only satisfactory action. Life isn't much like fiction, though. When my cousin Lou fell off a ladder while at work, this method of finding meaning through putting characters into action would not do. Lou was dead. Dead on the day he signed the mortgage for his new house. Dead, leaving a widow and 2 small sons to grow up without him. That news arrived as no kind of story with its attendant rising action and complications. And no story I might invent could make sense of Lou's death. Once there was a man, and now there was a void. And try reading that sentence to yourself after Frank's death. Anyways, continuing. Once there was a man, now there was a void. With no larger purpose than to try to fill that void, I felt in my heart, I began making notes to myself. Blurts, I've come to call them. And those blurts seemed to pop up anywhere, in the back of a composition class I was observing, as I drove to and from school, when I unfolded the schematic diagram in the back of my motorcycle's owner's manual, and when I went home to see my family. Here was a dilemma that would not let go of me. As I wrote down those notes, as I struggled to come to an understanding, I began by accident to build what became an essay. What other form of the essay could hold this kind of information? How any one of my blurts might lead to another is a bafflement to me. But I think my brain and your brain, dear reader, work this way. Our thoughts are not linear. And when we begin thinking of X and then we discover that we're thinking of Y instead, and we can't remember the chain of thoughts that took us from X to Y, well, we have demonstrated in a small way the path an essay may often take. Our thought processes are not unlike those wonderful pinball machines found in every cafe, truck stop, and beer joint when I was a kid. Put the ball in play, keep it going with the flippers, and pretty soon all the bumpers are lit and the ball is jumping back and forth between them. Each bumper could be an idea, an emotion, a metaphor, a little anecdote, all linked by that silver ball. And I'll just break there to say that for me, Frank was a flipper on the pinball machine of life. He kept me propelled through my writing career, even long after I left Alaska. So I'm going to jump ahead real fast, just a couple small short snippets from 2 other paragraphs, and then I'll conclude with a little piece of sage advice from Frank at the very end of this essay, near the end of this essay, so for the preface. So picking back up. I should admit that the essay is a way of getting at questions I can't get at by other means. And I should also admit that I often don't know how to frame the question I may be chasing or where my chase will lead. And then skipping down. The questions I care most about don't have easy answers. These are questions of how we live with one another, how we live with other animals, how to make meaning of this life, and how to value it aesthetically. In fact, such questions may have no answers at all, and still they must be asked. So I'll leave it there with Frank's words, and I thank him for helping me to continue to ask questions of life and to always ask how I can be better as a person, as a writer, and as a reader. Thanks again for inviting me for this. Thanks.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful. And we have, before I turn it over to Peggy to pull things together for us all, we have one last reader, Frank's great friend, fellow adventurer, former neighbor, Dave Musgrave.
All right, good luck getting through this. Thanks, Cass. Thanks for introducing me. Let me pull it together here. And thank you, Lila, for pulling this together. I see so many longtime friends from Fairbanks, and I miss you all. On this screen, I see my former neighbor, John Gimble. I see Dorley, John Morgan, Peggy Shoemaker. Let's see who else on this particular one. I've known Barb Hood since 1975 when I was a grad student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And even you, Sam Lamont, I love you and miss you. So, and for all the rest that I can't see right now, I really miss you, my Fairbanks friends. And of course, my dearest friend, Margot Class. Glad you're here, Margot. And so nice to see you. So, you know, already Nancy alluded to another kind of loneliness, and that piece really speaks to me. Frank and I did a lot of biking and skiing and other outdoor adventures together. And so I'll read from that. But first, and it's actually appropriate because I just came in for my first ski of the season up in Hatcher Pass, where I live close to now. So I will start that. But first I want to read something from Unpleasant Trees, and the title of the piece, Why Is It That We Do This? And it'll say something about how Frank died as he lived, on a bike, pushing his limits, and that's the way Frank was. And he really gets to the heart of that in not only this piece, but the Another Kind of Loneliness. And so I'll just, I only have a couple short paragraphs in this one, and I'll go ahead with it. As we grow slower, as we travel shorter distances, how do we come to terms with who we are, who we were, and who we are becoming? Is there a better question to ask any person who persists in running, skiing, cycling, or playing any sport where almost everybody else his age is taken to his couch to watch people on TV do better the thing he tried to do in a younger life? How lasting is lasting fame anyway? Some years ago, my pal Musgrave and I were cycling up the hill to our houses, up Spinach Creek Hill in Fairbanks, steep and longish. I said, "What are we going to do when we can't do this anymore?" "Play checkers, I guess," Musgrave said. Well, you know, Frank never reached that point. His life got cut short. He didn't play checkers. He was pushing it at the end. And from what I hear, he was going at incredible speed when he hit that, when his wheel came off. And it's just sad. So let me go to Another Kind of Loneliness right now. The thing I like about this is how I really knew Frank. And this piece speaks to me because I've gone through the same experience. And Frank and I used to talk about this quite a bit. And what's really interesting about this piece, as well as a lot of his other writings, his personal essays, is how self-deprecating he is. And it really is an insight into him. And so I'll just go ahead and start it off. And I want to say also, I first saw this piece published in the Alaska Nordic Skier, and I was touched by it. And I was glad I was able to find this. Actually, it was somebody else who provided, maybe it was even Robert Hammond, who's on here, who provided this to me, or it was somebody else from the ski club, I believe. But I'm really glad they were able to find this for me because I was looking for it. Another Kind of Loneliness. It's dark outside. I'm alone in the ski hut, adding layer on layer to my ski clothes. Though some trails at the university are lighted, I will take the longer, darker path through the woods. The last thing I do is strap on my headlamp, feeding the battery pack down my back under all my clothes so it will stay warm next to my skin. This must be crazy, setting out alone when it's 20 below, but I know these trails so well that when I cannot sleep, one of my tricks to overcome insomnia is to ski them in my mind. Each hill, each turn, I travel behind the science buildings, the student apartments, and married student housing, across a small lake, then seemingly deeper into the woods on the other side because I'm never really that far from the road. It's there I have sometimes met the great horned owl, heard it first, and then spotted it. Once it spit down one of its compacted, regurgitated pellets, sending it tumbling into the snow at the base of the big spruce where it roosted. A gift? A judgment? In America, it's almost criminal offense to be lonely. At the very least, it's unhealthy. Crazy, as I've said. Roy Orbison, leading, only the lonely know the way I feel tonight. Only the lonely know this feeling ain't right. I need to be here alone in these woods. For 30 years, I've made my living as a teacher, a reluctant public man. Teaching has its many pleasures. It also has its costs for a shy person. Somehow I knew I could teach in the way that equally shy people know they can go on stage and act. The two are not unrelated. Up there in front of a class, I was a performer with a clear role. Up there, I spent a good bit of energy keeping myself inflated. Students have a right to expect you to be pretty much the same person every day. I could do that. It was something I was good at. But to do it, I had to go away from people to get myself back. I'm a most moose-like man, tall, gangly, clumsy, slow. Above all, an animal given to loneliness. Moose, except for those moments when the urge to mate comes over them, would rather be alone. You might see them in any weather, nosing in the snow, browsing for willow shoots, standing in lakes, reaching to the bottom for weeds. You will rarely see them, moose particularly, in the company of other moose. Moose are ruminants. My wife, Margot's son, had recently returned from Africa, from Ethiopia and Namibia. He went to India as a junior in college and has returned many times. I have no interest in these places, rightly or wrongly. In my mind, they stand for crowds of people. Here are places I imagine myself going to: the high desert of the American Southwest, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the open ocean. Having been to the refuge once, I would go again, stay longer in a place where sometimes a person can go for hours without hearing another human sound, that of a passing airplane. Having tried once unsuccessfully to take part in a Quaker meeting, I know I'm no good at what the Buddhists call sitting. I cannot be still, cannot quiet my mind. Though I tried a time or two, I see now I have no interest in quieting my mind. The people that can and do amazes me and baffle me. I'm a ruminant too. Once on my skis, I step into the set tracks and begin. At first, I'm inclined to move fast or to rush through the glide that makes skiing, not just running on boards. When I came to the first long flat, I double pull and kick double pull, then return to a stride and begin to find a rhythm I can relax into. I seem to myself to be going slower, but actually I'm moving faster than the herky-jerky way I began. Rather than a skier, I was made to be a basketball player. In my fashion, I was. I could run the floor, jump high, block shots and rebound, even shoot a little on some nights. Basketball, though, is a social game, as socially complicated as any game I know. Each player is endowed, at least in principle, with all the same powers to go anywhere on the court, to pass, to shoot from anywhere. Each player must share these powers with his teammates in complex proportions in accordance with his skills. The only hierarchy in a basketball floor is one imposed by players themselves and their coach. Here's where I got into trouble. With every missed shot, every bad pass, I imagine my teammates passing judgment on me, and deservedly so. Some games I got so I wouldn't shoot the ball at all. Who was I to be taking another shot when I had just missed 1-2 feet from the basket? Every Sunday in season, I ski with a group of guys in the scum, Susie's class of uncoachable men. Incrementally, Susan Sugai has made us better skiers. Along the way, scums have become a social institution as well. Old Birch Hill Ski Hut has become our de facto clubhouse. Sometimes we come together to clear trails, have a season-ending potluck, go on summer bike rides. These are good people, good friends. We kid around, we sometimes work out pretty hard. Nobody blames me for skiing poorly or envies me in the unlikely event I ski well. But the scum probably stretched me to the limit of my sociability. In the jostling give and take, I found myself yearning to hit the trail, to ski away to quietude. In that quiet, what do? What do I think about out there? My headlight bobbing along in the dark. What should I do beyond putting one ski ahead of another? Sometimes I'm ashamed to say I review perceived slights and recriminations, fresh quarrels, things that somebody said or did that seem hurtful to me somehow. I grind away at such an event over and over, review every detail of what was said and what I might have said or done in return. I grind it to dust, wear it out. I just can't mess with it anymore. Somehow the hurt is made to go away. Is that what the psychologists mean by working through a problem? If I'm truly like a moose, it seems like I should have a tougher hide. Maybe instead I should seek better to know myself. Samuel Beckett believed we could never come to know ourselves fully, no matter how hard we tried. I think I believe that as well, but I think perhaps like Beckett, a person still has to keep seeking to know, but where and how? I can do like Montaigne and ceaselessly fork over every thought that goes through my head. Montaigne compared his own restless mind to a field left fallow and allowed to go to weeds or to masses and shapeless lumps of flesh. In other words, a mess-making machine. What's up there in my head is a big balloon. Skiing along, I fill the balloon with words, images, things seen, things heard, things imagined. Many of these thoughts must be so private they can be shared with nobody else, not because they're banal, sexual, or self-aggrandizing, and therefore embarrassing, morally questionable, possibly crazy if exposed to the light of day, but because they are just so many shapeless lumps. Taken together, they make a landscape that exists in my head only. In this way, they're like paintings of Eva Tanguay. What are some of those strange, tuberous things? Those figures could belong on cave walls, in kindergarten drawings, as art as therapy. Those shapes that look like jigsaw puzzles, parsnips, amoebas, architecture from another planet. It can be wrong to call them misshapen because they rarely attempt to represent anything we know. Their titles, Extinction of Useless Light, The Mood of Now, say, are just jokes against any viewers who might try too hard to make meaning when the paintings are meaning in themselves. When I stand in the yard while the representative from Bigfoot pumping and thawing drains the septic, I want a full report on the state of my plumbing. Nothing serious. The guy assures me as he works his hose around, just a few solids. That's it, solids. I'm looking for solids. I think this matters. I'm looking for solids, lumping shapes that will become somehow meaningful. I persist in the belief that the mind is capable and again of taking self by surprise, thinking new, fresh thoughts, and at least new and fresh to me and possibly to others. Who can know? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. When I'm running a race or ski marathon, a century bike ride, despite being in the presence of others, I'm essentially alone. Once here in Fairbanks, I've found both my hamstring muscles cramping at least 10 kilometers of the Sonat, in the last 10 kilometers of the Sonat Kazoo, a 50-kilometer ski event. I could see my fellow scum, Dave Bloom, suffering in much the same way. But seeing his pain did nothing to alleviate mine, did nothing to make my own struggle to the finish any easier. I've never asked Dave whether my presence did anything to help him along. To do so would be out of character. What do people think when they see a moose browsing along a road or trail on a cold day deep in the winter? Do they think, say, that this animal is unhappy or out there, that is lonely? There is no getting around the fact that the moose is alone. But it's we people who think too often of being alone as a desolate state, that being alone is in itself an unhappy way to be. So lonesome I could die, as Hank Wilson put it. I think I'll end there. I think you get the gist of Frank's connection to the land of Fairbanks, to his fellow skiers, and to just being outside and alone. And I also want to say, since this was an essay about his physical doings, that the last time I saw Frank is just before I left on a trip in mid-July up to Anwar myself, going along with Don Pendergrass and several others, including Margaret Mannix, who is on here today. She wasn't able to make it because we cut our trip short. But it was the same thing. It was Frank and I and the Scums and John Estel's running group, and we were ski walking up to the top of Esther Dome. And I had to keep up with Frank. I mean, and then at the end, I thought, oh, I can take him in, which I really had to push to do that. But it was the thing that I really took me is that Frank, he didn't look like a moose. he looks like T-Rex when he's skiing or ski walking. His hands are all tucked in, his elbows are near his side, and he looks like he could barely walk, but he still pushed it, and so that's the last reflection I have of Frank, and I really miss him dearly, and I know you all do too. And it's so nice to see all these people here who I know by reputation but have never met, but I know by reputation through Frank. So thanks again.
Thank you, Dave. That was wonderful. I'm just about to turn it over to my friend Peggy Shoemaker, my fellow moderator, to sum things up. We had a planning meeting a couple of days ago to decide on the order of things and the roles that Peggy and I would have. And I quickly volunteered to provide an introduction and pass the speaking stick along because I really wanted to leave the hard part of summary and last words to my wise and generous friend, Peggy Shoemaker. So I will just say thank you to all of you who were readers, for your readings, for your images, for your recollections, to Robert for the sound of Frank's voice, and to all of you who are able to join us here today. And with that, I'll turn things over to Peggy.
Thank you, Kes. I have just put into the chat 2 items that might be of interest to the people who are part of this community. One is that Susan Sugai, Frank's ski coach that Dave just mentioned, is the guiding spirit behind the Frank Soos Creative Writing Scholarship. If anyone is interested in contributing to that scholarship, I put the information in the chat. And secondly, Frank's new book is ready for pre-order, and I also put that into the chat, and you're welcome to take a look. But before I talk more about the new book and read you a brief excerpt from that, Margot would like to say a few words to us all.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Cass. This has been a wonderful evening, evening in Maine, that is. I'm here with my son, Will, and daughter, Ingrid, and I know I speak for them and for Tom Moose, Frank's brother, in saying thank you so much to all the readers for your recollections, for your images, for the choices that you gave us of his words, because that's what we will treasure forever. And I know I wasn't on the list of speakers, but I'd like to read just a little something too. And I'm going to circle back to Kess's introduction of his 100 best ideas when I do this. These ideas have been coming one at a time, maybe 2 at a time, over many years, as Kess said. And he declares in his introduction that he has suggested that we use, that they all are the result of a certain kind of puzzling. And I think we've heard a little bit about the questioning mind that Frank had and the kind of rumination that he did on his bike, on his skis, alone, all together. And very often we would talk about them, and they were great discussions. Here's something that Frank says about these 100 best ideas. He said, "It took me about a decade to come up with this assemblage, which may speak best of how I feel about our human endeavors." And I think that really sums up really what these 100 ideas turn out to be. The one I would like to read to you is not surprising that it is among them, and it's called Gratitude. It reads, "We come into this life wanting everything, bawling and squalling all of our wants. For the rest of our lives, what remains is to offer our thanks. And that's what I offer to you as well. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm so glad to see you, that you're here. And I send you all my love. Thank you.
And love to you, Margot, and to Ingrid and Will and Dan, and Tom or Moose, whatever you prefer, and Anna. Thank you all for being here. Jessie Cherry just put in the chat that there is another book that's coming too called Wheels on Ice that she and Frank were putting together. And so please check that out in the chat. So Lila, would you mind putting the picture of the cover back up? These last few months, Frank's been putting the finishing touches on a new book of stories, 9 new short stories. You can see that the cover is based on an exquisite piece of art by Margot. The piece of art was not rectangular, but the cover is, so Margot graciously allowed the book designer to crop the image to make it fit on the cover, but it's called The Getting Place. And as you might expect, because it's Frank, it involves sports and rock and roll and art, high literature, fishing, popular culture, just about anything else you could think of. I'm going to read just a tiny bit, a brief excerpt from a story called Sitting Down to Read Anna Karenina Again. In this story, there is a seduction scene, and I think it might be the only seduction scene in literature that involves a guy ironing wax onto his skis and a woman really seducing herself. It's a very interesting seduction scene. The main character's name is Mim. Mim, the mother of 2 young girls, is just realizing, oh, this is Mim, the mother of 2 young girls, this is mine, is just realizing that her predictable, dependable, empty, cold marriage is stultifying. Mim wanted peace, but that meant she shut down her inner life. She's just beginning to realize that there are more options for living than she's allowed herself. Longing for touch, for beauty, for elegance, she takes as her lover a man who loves the women who come his way, a man who has found himself in the ski hut with 3 women he's made love to in the past year alone. So after an afternoon of great passion, here are Mim's thoughts. And now this is from Frank's story. This, Mim saw, is why Anna Karenina sat and cried after Vronsky took her on her parlor floor. Not because of shame, as Tolstoy may have thought, but because she suddenly no longer knew who she was. She was no longer just a wife and mother and could not go back to that place in her heart, no matter how hard she tried, no matter how hard she might want to. But who was she now? A woman who had just wrung herself out through wanting, through pleasure. A woman who'd allowed a man to see her naked and coming in broad daylight, who'd opened herself to him that fully. Now she must wonder who he really was, whether he understood and was capable of understanding. Girlfriend, are you out of your mind? This was Rachel talking, blurting really. But Mim had to tell somebody. So she called up Rachel and asked her to meet her for breakfast at Sam's Sourdough. I did. I slept with him. How could you? He gave me fruit to eat. Jesus God, Rachel said. Fruit to eat, that's all it took? There's a Bible story you might know about that trick. A little later in the story. There are still very many things Mim does not know, beginning with who she is and what she hopes for. She's trying to figure herself out, admittedly a lifelong project. And she does think of poor Anna Karenina from time to time, thinks how her own or anybody's really life can seem to be like a book or a story. Some things happen, may happen in unexpected and undesirable ways. Happen whether you want them to or not. Sometimes Mim can still be pretty damn miserable, but that doesn't mean she sees the path of her life as inevitable. This wasn't a lesson Tolstoy could teach her, something she sees he was all wrong about. Instead, she realized she'd learned all she needed to know from Anne Landers, that wise lady she'd read as a girl every day in the blue field paper. Over and over again, Anne counseled the confused and brokenhearted that a person didn't go looking for love with somebody else if everything was okay with the one she was with. So frank. And I'll tell you, these new stories are funny, they're grim, they are thought-provoking, they're so deeply intelligent, and they just are really, really rewarding. And I hope you treat yourself, because they're really valuable stories. This time, this community has mattered so much to all of us. And I thank you so much for joining together, for coming together, even though COVID doesn't let us hug one another. This is the next best thing. So thank you, everybody. And thank you especially Lila and Sue and the Alaska Center for the book. Thank you, Susan Sugai. And thanks again to Kes, to Margot, to Ingrid, to Dan, to Will, to Moose, to Anna. Thanks, everybody.
Lila, this is Dave. I'm just going to ask if you could leave the meeting open. Maybe some friends could reconnect here after the formal part of the meeting.
Sure, we'll be happy to do that.
And Lila, I have one question for you. The recording will be available in what form and where?
I'll have to let you know, Peggy.
Okay. Well, if there's a way to is there a way to let everybody know who has attended?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks to you all.
For those that are staying on, would you like the recording to stop here? Because it will be posted publicly somewhere on